name is Chris. I'm with Tempe Hillsborough County Public Library, and now I would like to hand things over to our librarian, Carmen, who's going to introduce our presenter. Hey, Carmen.
Hey. Hi, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the Family Heritage Festival. I'm a librarian at the Florida History Genealogy Library located downtown. And today, I just want to let you guys know that you can check out our website, hcplc.org/familyhistory, to look at some book lists and to see the other events that we had as part of the Family Heritage Festival. Today we're looking forward to giving a book shout out to the Family Tree Guide to DNA Testing and Genetic Genealogy by Blaine T. Bettinger. You can find this book as a physical book available for checkout through curbside services in our catalog, and also as an ebook on Overdrive. So please check out our website, hcplc.org, to get started with that. Now, I would like to introduce Drew Smith, our presenter for Before You Test, DNA Basics You Need to Know. Drew Smith is the genealogy librarian at the USF Libraries. He is host of the Genealogy Collection podcast and co-host of the Genealogy Guys podcast. He is the author of the book, Organize Your Genealogy, Strategies and Solutions for Every Researcher, and co-author of the book, Advanced Genealogy Research Techniques. He can be reached via email at dsmith@usf.edu.
Thank you, Carmen. And it's good to be with you all again. And hopefully you are seeing my title slide. I think if not, someone will let me know, but I'm assuming that you are. And,
we see it.
Good, thanks, Chris. And so, DNA has been something that I've been involved with for quite some time. DNA testing for genealogy, it's been around a little over 10 years now. And so as a kid, I was fascinated with genetics. I was fascinated with just the science behind this all. So when DNA became part of genealogy as a part of the research, I was immediately interested in learning everything I could about it. And so I certainly don't know as much as Blaine Bettinger does, and so I do list his book in the bibliography as well. So it's a great book for you after this session to use. But let's go ahead and get started here. I'm going to be talking today, and I do understand that many of you may have already tested. That's okay. You're still going to, I think, benefit from this. But I'm going to talk about DNA as a genealogical record format and how it fits in with the other kinds of record formats that genealogists traditionally use. I'm going to talk about the different types of human DNA because there's more than one type. I'm going to talk about how each of the different types are inherited. They each have their own inheritance pattern. I'm going to talk briefly about how your research problem, whatever you're trying to solve in genealogy, how it determines maybe which test you take and who tests. And finally, I'll briefly go through the 5 major DNA testing companies to say what their differences are, what they have in common, and so forth. So as I mentioned, I brought up this idea of a genealogical record. There's no official definition for what a genealogical record is, but I've come up with my own. I said that it's a source of information that can tell us something about a person. Usually the person we're interested in is one of our ancestors, could be some other relative of ours, and it gives us some detail about their life, some fact about their life, some information about their life, or it may simply help us understand how that other person might be related to us, or how 2 different people might be related to each other. And these records come in many, many different formats. When you get started in genealogy as a beginning genealogist, you probably encounter the fact that a lot of material for genealogy is already in books, and not just how-to books that teach you how to do the research, but books about families, books about places, local history books, family history books. And none of this is very intimidating because, of course, we are already comfortable using books, and particularly nonfiction books, that usually will have a table of contents and an index. Hopefully the family history books you encounter have both a table of contents and preferably an index. We love it when genealogy books have an index. And none of that is terribly scary. We just realize this is stuff we have to read. And the same is true not just of books, but of also magazines and journals and newsletters, things like that. The next thing we probably encounter is microfilm or microfiche, these microforms that are materials that have been microfilmed in some way, and we realize that they are just another way to access information. For me, because I don't use it every day, and certainly lately I haven't been using it as much as I might have done back when I started doing genealogy in the 90s. It always takes me a while when I sit down at a microfilm reader and try to remember how to load the microfilm. That's something that people that use it every day don't have that problem. But once you get past that sort of little technical glitch of how do I put the microfiche in the microfiche reader or the microfilm on the microfilm reader, you realize that you're just reading and paging. And again, it's not very different than a book. So there's no technology beyond that to really learn. And so you just deal with that record format. The next thing is probably cemeteries and graveyards. And so what you learn about as a genealogical record format is, again, as children, as adults, we have visited cemeteries probably for the funerals of our relatives. And so we know what that's like. We know that we can see on a tombstone, often we can see a name and maybe some dates of when the person was born, when they died, possibly other information. And as a genealogist, as we visit cemeteries, we start noticing, though, we learn additional things to look for. We look for other information that might be on that stone. We realize it may tell us something about the person's military service. It might tell us something about their memberships in societies like the Masons and so forth, religious affiliations. So we start using those stones in more detailed ways. And we also learn that we need to look around the stone to see who's buried near them, because those things are important too. Who's buried in the same plot, who's buried behind them, in front of them, to the left and to the right. This is genealogical information. And then finally, photographs are, again, something that we're familiar with. Before we even get into genealogy, we know about family photos in particular. And here's one of my favorites of my one of my sets of grandparents and their 7 children. If sometimes I have people guess which one is my parent, and I'll go ahead and give it away on this one. But the woman sitting nearest to the TV on the sofa, that's my mother. And this picture was taken probably in the early 60s. I was there when it was taken, and I remember probably the last time that all 7 of the children, my mother and my aunts and uncles and my grandparents, were together before my grandfather passed away. And we also know that photographs can tell us so much for genealogy. We just have to learn more about them. We have to learn certainly to look on the back to see if anything's been written on it. We can look to see what's in the photograph, maybe based on how people are, what they're wearing, their hairstyles, technology like the TV. We can make guesses as to what year this was probably taken, and who the people are. So again, very comfortable, nothing that is going to cause us any intimidation when we deal with that. But what about DNA? So we see this and go, oh, science, scary. Well, a little, but what is it? It's a source of information. There's information that we can learn. It can tell us about a person's ancestors, not even just their distant ancestors. It can tell them about even recent ancestors. It can be compared with DNA of other people. And so that's really helpful when we can compare one DNA test, perhaps our own, with DNA of someone else to see if we can figure out how we might be related. And therefore, it ticks all those boxes. It is a genealogical record format, I would tell you. And because it's a genealogical record format, as a genealogist, we should learn how to use it. You can do this. You can learn how to use DNA. It's science, but it's not crazy science that you're going to need a degree or anything special to understand. So how does it work? What is this thing called DNA, and how does it work? Well, it's a molecule. It's a complex molecule. water is a molecule, H2O. It's a very simple molecule. DNA is just a complicated molecule with a formula that even I don't know what it is off the top of my head, and it's very complicated because it varies so much from living thing to living thing and from person to person. And during the reproductive process, our parents give a portion of their DNA to each of their children. So no matter how many children they have, they pass along some portion of their DNA, which we'll get into, to their children. And this goes on generation after generation after generation. But the thing about DNA that if you haven't started to look at it yet or think about it, it's not all the same. When we say human DNA, as if there's just one big thing called human DNA, but it's really, there are different types of human DNA. And we have to learn about these different types. One reason we have to learn these different types is because they're inherited differently. And as genealogists, we care about inheritance. We care about the relationship from one generation to the next. And so we have to understand these types of DNA and how they are inherited from one generation to the next, because by doing that and looking at and it helps us determine, is there a certain type of DNA test that I should take because of the question I have, the research question I have. And also, once you get the results, the different types, the results are going to look different, and you need to figure out, what can I learn from the results of this type of test versus the results of some other type of test. Now, I promise you that this is the most scientific graph that you're going to see on any of the slides here. But bear with me. The only things we really care much about are two of the pieces here. So we can ignore most of those numbered items there. 1 and 2 refers to the nucleus. Every cell, basically, there's going to be a nucleus in almost every cell. There's an exception. And then outside the nucleus, there are these things called mitochondria. The singular is mitochondrion, and they kind of float around. And so they're outside the nucleus in this other part of the cell. And there's DNA in both of them. So we can divide all DNA and all human DNA into two major types. The mitochondrial DNA is in the mitochondrion, and there could be a few dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of mitochondria in each human cell. And in other words, there's a lot of mitochondrial DNA in human cells. In fact, that's why when they often find remains of whether it's even remains from 100 years ago or remains of human beings from tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years ago, mitochondrial DNA is the most likely to survive, partially because it's just sheer amount of it. There's so much of it in so many cells. And it also, it's more likely going to survive for that reason. There's just so much. Nuclear DNA, as I said, it's in the nucleus, and all human cells, and of course we've got something like several trillion human cells. The only ones that really don't have nuclear DNA are mature red blood cells. They don't have a nucleus. So mature red blood cells do have mitochondrial DNA, but not nuclear DNA. But when you do DNA testing, they're not really testing blood. They're not testing certainly red blood. They're testing really getting more of your white blood cells, which do have the nuclear DNA. So that's what's going on there. And of course, they also pick up the mitochondrial when you take those DNA tests. I'm going to start by talking about mitochondrial DNA because it is sort of the simplest of all the types. So mitochondrial DNA is really, as I say, small. Now, when we look at small bits of DNA, just if we were looking at small bits of computer information, we'd be talking about bytes, or we'd be talking about bits. Those are the smallest amounts of computer information we can talk about meaningfully. Well, when we talk about DNA, the smallest meaningful bits of DNA are called bases. Sometimes they're called nucleobases, or and so bases are the smallest amounts, and there are about, in mitochondrial DNA, there are about 16,500. Not exactly that number, but approximately that number. It can vary a little bit. And so in terms of just the amount, that's not much. And it's in a circular structure. It's like a ring. This is not surprising that it's in a ring. It's not like that DNA you kind of picture where it's these long chains that are strands. It's actually more like, as I say, it's like a circular structure. And bacteria out there in the world have a circular structure for their DNA. That's not coincidental. There's a great belief that mitochondria in our cells are actually the descendants from many millions of years ago of when the first multicellular organisms came into existence, and or cellular organisms, and mitochondria as bacteria took up residence and then continued to be reproduced just like the actual organism that they had entered into. And they simplified a bit. So they got rid of some of the fancier parts of their structures, but they kept that circular structure of DNA because it's pretty basic. And the inheritance pattern of mitochondrial DNA is very clear. The mitochondria that every human being has, their mitochondria came from their mother. So in other words, it's a copy. And how does that happen? Well, both the egg cell and the sperm cell have mitochondrial DNA, but when conception occurs, the mitochondria from the sperm cell are discarded. And so that leaves only the mitochondria from the egg cell. And that means that all of us have our mother's mitochondria, our mother's mitochondrial DNA, a copy of that. So basically the inheritance pattern comes out to be that we get our mitochondrial DNA from our mothers got it from her mother, she got it from her mother, all the way back, talking, hundreds of thousands of years to before, of course, genealogical records or anything. But that's where it all comes from. And so it's very useful. Now, if we all had the same mitochondrial DNA, well, obviously this would not be very useful because it would be like all of us having the same last name. If we all had the same last name, genealogy would be a heck of a lot harder than it is. Fortunately, we're in that sort of sweet spot just with genealogy. We don't want everybody to have the same last name, but we don't want everybody to have different names because it's having the same name that helps us determine people are related. Same thing with mitochondrial DNA. We fortunately don't all have the same mitochondrial DNA, but it's also not completely different because otherwise we wouldn't match anybody, and as a result, we wouldn't be able to determine how we're related. So how does that work? Well, if you go back far enough, and DNA, this is true of DNA in general, it's copied from generation to generation. And I want to bring up, there's the childhood game that goes by a couple of different names. Telephone is one, where you play it as a kid, or where a bunch of kids line up and the first kid whispers something into the next kid's ear, a phrase or something funny, a sentence, and that kid tries to remember what it was or understand what it was and whisper it to the next kid until it gets all the way to the other end, and then usually what's at the other end is completely different because it changed every time it got passed from one person to the other. Well, DNA copying is a bit like that. It's every time DNA is copied from a parent to a child, then some of those bases, like those 16,500 bases, they're not copied perfectly. There can be I would call it a copy error. It's not a perfect copy. So a couple things can happen. One of the bases, and by the way, there are 4 types of bases. You may have seen these abbreviated as A, G, T, and C. You don't have to know what they stand for, but those are the DNA code letters that are the base codes. When they're copied, it could change to a different base. So an A could change to a T, or a G could change to a C, or whatever. And so that means that the person receiving it gets a different base. We're talking again, remember, of this ring of 16,500 bases. So another thing that can happen during the copying process is that a new base could be added to the ring, one that wasn't even in the original. It just gets added in. And so you end up with one more base than you started with, and maybe more than one, but typically just one more. Or the opposite could happen. Of those 16,500 bases, one could be deleted, in other words, not copied at all. And so the ring gets one base shorter. So all of these changes, changing to a different base, adding one or more new bases, adding or deleting one or more existing bases, these are called mutations. A mutation is nothing more than a change that occurs during the copying process. All right. So I've taken a mitochondrial DNA test. The only company that really does useful for genealogical purposes mitochondrial DNA test is Family Tree DNA, which is a small company in Houston, Texas. They've been doing this pretty much longer than anybody in the business doing DNA testing for genealogy. So they've done this stuff a long time. And I took the mitochondrial test with them. They actually offer a couple of levels of it. These days, you can do kind of a part test, or you can do the entire thing. I've done the entire thing. In other words, I've tested the 16,500 bases, what they call the full mitochondrial sequence. Once you've done that, there's no more you can do with mitochondria. You've learned everything you can learn about your mitochondrial DNA once you've taken that full mitochondrial test. And I took mine back 8 years ago, really. So I've had it out there a long time. This is what my results can look like. Now, if you look at the top of the screen, when I took this screenshot, it may have been a couple of months ago, but I match 171 people. What does that mean? It means that there's 171 people who've also tested with Family Tree DNA, have tested their mitochondrial DNA, all of it, and I match, and the difference between what mine looks like and theirs is a very small number. So it's what they call genetic distance. Okay, so genetic distance just means that how many mutations different are there between my mitochondrial DNA and the other person's mitochondrial DNA. If you look at this page, by the way, you're going to see everybody there in that third column. It says FMS, that stands for full mitochondrial sequence. And the genetic distance, they sort this list. You can sort it in different orders, but my list is sorted by genetic distance. So all the people who have the closest genetic distance, a low number is better, are shown first. And you can see here, I have about 10 out of this 171. 10 of them have a genetic distance to me of 0. That means that my mitochondrial DNA and their mitochondrial DNA are exactly the same. There's no difference here. So that's great. I mean, those people should be the closest to me, even genealogically, because we have the exact same DNA. Now, I've blocked out their names for privacy purposes, but I'll explain what some of the other things you see here. There's an envelope that means you can click there and you can email the person. It'll go to them. There's a place to put notes. This is for yourself. They won't see that. There's a family tree that they've put out there for some of them. Not everybody has a family tree, some do. I've already said what FMS stands for. FMS stands for, and FF stands for Family Finder, which is the other kind of test that's useful to take here, which is their autosomal test. I'll come back to that much later in the presentation. And people can then upload, or type in, I should say, their earliest known mitochondrial ancestor, meaning their earliest female ancestor through that matrilineal line, their mother's line, because that's the person who arguably I should be descended from. If not them, then maybe their mother or their maternal grandmother or so forth on back. So in fact, if I look at this list, the bottom two, who I matched way back in 2012 and 2014, they list a couple of women in South Carolina. Excuse me. And these women, in fact, my ancestor is in South Carolina. But I do not know who Frances Moore or Delaney Owens are. I have not figured out how they're related to my ancestor yet. So it just probably means that one of their ancestors, Frances and Delaney's ancestors, is an ancestor to my earliest known matrilineal ancestor. Abigail Howland, that was rather impressive. Someone had done the research all the way back into the 1600s. They actually had traced their female-only line, matrilineal line, all the way back to the 1600s. Quite impressive. And I was very impressed when I saw that. And I remember communicating with the person and suddenly realizing that it was a nationally known genealogist, someone I was acquainted with. And so we were able to compare notes. We still don't know how I might be descended from Abigail if I am descended from Abigail. Because again, I could be descended from Abigail's mother, but not Abigail, or Abigail's grandmother, but not her mother. So I don't know. So those are the useful things. I won't have time to get into haplogroup here. If there's time in the question and answer, we can do that. And you can see that I'm still matching new people as new people take the test. One was as recent as January of this year, but every year or so I have new people show up in my list, and one of the most recent is, again, a perfect match, a genetic distance match of 0. So this is kind of interesting. The trouble with mitochondrial DNA is I generally don't recommend genealogists take it, for a couple reasons that may become obvious here. It's a little pricey compared to some of the other tests. Secondly, because mitochondrial DNA mutates very slowly, the common ancestor could be hundreds of years in the past. It's possible that my common ancestor to Mary Ann Howell, Abigail Howland, and the rest are maybe back in the 1600s in England or earlier. So there's no way to know for sure just yet until all the research has been done. So, as I said, it's not the best test to start with or spend money on unless you have a very particular kind of question you need answered, and we'll come back to that a bit later. So, let's talk about nuclear DNA. Nuclear DNA is much more interesting for several reasons, and we can divide it into two types. There's what's called autosomal DNA, and autosomal DNA is, there's 22 pairs of autosomes, so 22 pairs of these chromosomes that we have gotten, and they are numbered in their pairs from pair 1 to pair 22. Pair 1 is the largest, pair 22 is the smallest. Allosomal, not a term you're likely going to hear very often. Instead, you're probably going to hear the term the sex chromosomes or the sex determining chromosomes. This is a pair of chromosomes, and women, a typical woman will have 2 X chromosomes, and a male will have 1 X and 1 Y. So, as you might gather, then it's the Y chromosome that results in someone being male, and the not having the Y that results in someone being female. Now, here's what the chromosomes kind of look like. If you were to be able to separate them all out and number them and put the large ones together and the pairs together. So you can see that pair 1 is the longest, all the way down to pair 22 on the bottom right. That's pretty short. And then you see the X and Y. And by the way, they're not called X and Y because they're shaped like an X or shaped like a Y. If there had been a third one, it would have been called Z. It's just letters to be assigned. And you can even see that the X is bigger than the Y. The Y is a pretty small chromosome, almost like a size of the numbers 21 and 22, and the X is more like some of the more intermediate ones. So this is what relative size-wise these chromosomes look like. And by the way, men and women, we all get these from our parents, where each of these pairs, one comes from mom, one comes from dad. So that's why they come in pairs, is we get those from our parents. Let's start and talk about the Y DNA because it's, again, sort of the simplest. So Y DNA, as I said, only males have it. And, that's, women cannot take a Y DNA test. They don't have a Y chromosome. And that means that a male, all males have a Y chromosome, a male gets it from their father. Now, in typical Western culture where surnames are passed from generation to generation, it's very common that people have the surname of their fathers. Of course, there have been obviously the culture has started to change a little bit in that way, but that's still the most common situation. And that means that the Y chromosome and the surname tend to be linked, because basically, I got my Smith name from my father, who got it from his father, who got it from his father, and I got my Y chromosome from my father, who got it from his father, who got it from his father. So you generally see that Y chromosomes tend to be almost associated with a surname. Now, there can be, I made a mention there, of misattributed paternity. Of course, we're assuming here that the genealogical father or the legal father is the biological father, and we know that they're sometimes not the case. And we may not know, once we get back generations way back when, we may have no earthly idea or any evidence that that's not the case, that the father is someone else, until we do DNA testing, when we suddenly discover sometimes these things, that someone's legal or genealogical father is not their biological father. This does happen. So the inheritance pattern is, oddly enough, sort of the opposite of the mitochondrial pattern. Again, only men have this, one difference here, but they get it from their father, who got it from his father, who got it from his father, all the way back however many hundreds of thousands of years. But of course, there can be mutations in Y DNA as well. Now, I've taken a Y DNA test with Family Tree DNA. Again, I took it about 8 years ago. And I wanted to see, again, do I match anybody? One reason I was very curious to take a Y-DNA test was because my surname is Smith. And there's a lot of Smiths out there. And of course, not all Smiths are related. The Smith surname was adopted throughout Europe and so forth by different people at different times for occupational purposes, whatever. And all I knew was that my Smiths were from Ireland when I did this test, but I didn't know where in Ireland. And I thought, okay, if I take a Y-DNA test and I match some other Smiths and their ancestors are from Ireland, and they may know what county in Ireland or what place in Ireland they're from, maybe that'll give me some clues to where to look for my ancestors in Ireland. So that's what I did. I took the test from Family Tree DNA, and here we go. I got only one match. I took what's called a 37 marker test, which is the least expensive that you really want to do that's being offered. Anything less than that really provides you no useful information. And these markers, which are called STR markers, I matched one gentleman at a genetic distance of 3. That means that he and I, of the 37 markers, 34 are exactly the same, and the other 3, there's a slight difference. So he is a Smith, which is number one. It's good news. He's also a Smith, so there's no mystery of probably misattributed paternity on either of our lines. And he's a Smith with ancestors from Ireland. His ancestor is Patrick Smith from County Antrim. And I might have said, oh, well, that tells me that my ancestor, who later I learned his name was, the earliest was Philip Smith, maybe he's in County Antrim. Well, I later learned through other genealogical sources, like a letter written by Philip Smith, that he was from County Cavan, so not close to County Antrim, really. So their common ancestor, Patrick Smith in County Antrim, and my Philip Smith from County Cavan, they're descended from some other Smith from further back in time. But again, it didn't solve my problem, but it could have solved that problem. And many people get, when they do these tests, they don't get just one match, they may get lots. So you also see that he's actually taken a 111 marker test. So if I wanted to upgrade, and since then I have upgraded to the largest test that they offer, I could use that to get more detailed information. And you see the envelope, meaning I can email the person. You see the notes if I want to keep private notes about the person. And there's an orange tip box that is just a tool that tries to estimate how far back in time your common ancestor probably is. So let's now talk about autosomal. Autosomal is really going to be kind of the most useful thing here for genealogical purposes. So as I said, we get 50% of our father's autosomal DNA, 50% of our mother's, because what they do is they give us one of each of the 22 autosomal chromosomes. So they give us half of what they got. And I say half, they give us if your father has a pair of chromosome 1, he generally gives a mixture of his two chromosome 1s, and gives them as one single chromosome 1 to pass down. Same thing with your mother, her pair 1, she mixes up those two into form a single chromosome 1 and passes that down. But every sibling, every every child this pair of parents has, they're getting a different mixture. Unless they're identical twins, they're getting a different mixture, which is why you are not an identical twin typically to your siblings. You're different because you got different DNA. So now, the thing that you might fall into, a little bit of a trap here, is if you get 50% of your autosomal DNA from mom, 50% from dad, does that mean that, and dad got 50% from his father and 50% from his mother, and your mother got 50% from her father and 50% from her mother, does that mean that you get 25% from each of your 4 grandparents? And the answer is not exactly, because on average you do, but here's the deal. When your father gives you 50% of his DNA, there's no rule that says he has to give you an exact equal mixture of what he got from his father and what he got from his mother. He could give you a little more from his father and less from his mother, or vice versa. Same thing for your mother. She could give you more from her mother and less from her father, or vice versa. So while the average amount you get from each grandparent is 25%, the reality is it could be maybe 18% from one grandparent and 32% from the other grandparent of that couple. The two couple of the couple together, it has to be 50%, but it could be more from one than the other. And this continues on as you get back in time. You know, your great grandparents on average give you 12.5% of your DNA. Your great great grandparents give you 6.25%, and on back until the percentages are really low. The thing is, because there's a range here, it could be less, it could be more. Well, eventually you're going to get back to some ancestors of yours who didn't give you any DNA at all. And this shows you those probabilities. So when you're talking about your 16 great great grandparents, yeah, you probably, there's almost certainty you've got DNA from all 16. You do inherit that. If you go back to your 3 times great grandparents, your 32 3 times great grandparents, there's only about a 54% chance that you got a little bit of DNA from all of them. In other words, someone may have fallen out. And when you get back to the 4 times great grandparents, there's only, of the 64 of them, there's almost no chance that you got DNA from all 64. You for sure, almost for certainty, only got DNA from, well, less than 64 of them, 63, 62, 61. What this says, first of all, I want to be clear about that. Or does that mean you're not descended from these people? No, it's not what it means. You are genealogically their descendant. They are genealogically your ancestors. But genetically, you're not necessarily descended from them. Genetically, they may not be your ancestors because their DNA contribution to yours has been lost. This also explains why sometimes people wonder, well, I know that my great, 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 great grandparent was 100% Native American or 100% something else, and I'm not seeing it in my DNA. Well, it could be you inherited none of that. You know, none of it came down to you. And so just be aware of that's why autosomal DNA only works so many generations back before it starts becoming not so useful once you get back to a certain point. So it's very different than mitochondrial or Y-DNA, which can go way back. Yeah, this stuff doesn't necessarily go that far back. Now, how does that relate to your cousins? Well, if you have a second cousin, someone you've documented as a second cousin, or closer, they could be a first cousin or a first cousin once removed or a half first cousin, there's almost certainty. In fact, there are no known cases where you will not match a second cousin. Everybody matches their second cousins. So you share DNA with your second cousins. What about your third cousins? Now, remember, your second cousins, you share a great grandparent. Your third cousins, you share great great grandparents. Well, there's a 90% chance you're going to match all your third cousins, but that means there's about a 10% chance you've got some third cousins you don't match. The DNA did not come down to you and to your third cousin from your common ancestor where there was the same DNA. So that's okay. And then when you get to fourth cousins, about a half, 1 out of 2, you're going to match and the others you're not. And as you get to fifth cousins and sixth cousins, the probabilities get less and less and less and less. So you're not going to share DNA maybe with some of them. Your siblings might. They may have lucked out and gotten some DNA that matches those third, fourth, fifth, and sixth cousins that you didn't get. So if you have a documented sixth or fifth or fourth or third cousin and you're not sharing any DNA, don't panic. Nothing wrong with that. It happens. But if you've got a documented second cousin and you're not sharing any DNA, yeah, that's a red flag. That means someone's ancestor is not who they think it is, their genetic ancestor. Someone's got a problem in their family tree. The last type of DNA I want to get to, and then there'll be time for some questions here as we get near the end of this, is X-DNA. As I mentioned, that women have 2, men have only 1. So my X chromosome, because my father gave me a Y chromosome, my mother gave me an X. So it had to come from my mother. So any X DNA that men have comes from their mothers. Women get 1 from each parent. And it's interesting. We say, well, where does a woman's X chromosomes come from? Well, her parents. But really, we know 1 comes from her mother, but the one she got from her father, he got it from his mother. He just passed it through. So really, women, the 2 X chromosomes that women have, 1 comes from their mothers and the other comes from their paternal grandmothers. That's the inheritance pattern. The full inheritance pattern is a little trickier than that. I should mention this before I show the next slide. When a woman gives her children X DNA, remember women have 2 X chromosomes. She's going to give 1 to each of her children. She has some choices here. Again, she could mix the 2 X chromosomes she has and give her child a single X chromosome that's a mixture of the 2 that the woman has. That happens around 86% of the time, so it's pretty common. But what about the other 14% of the time? Well, the other 14% of the time, the woman gives her child, she just passes down the one that she got from her father or the one she got from her mother entirely without mixing. And that happens about 7% of the time with the one she got from her father and about 7% of the time that she got from her mother. So that means that sometimes the X chromosomes that we get from our mothers may not be a mixture. They might be from just one side of that family or the other. So this chart tries to explain that, and you can Google X-DNA inheritance charts if you want. It'll show you something like this. But really what this is trying to tell you is that only certain of your ancestors could have given you X-DNA because, for example, as a male, I have to get my X-DNA from my mother's side, so it's on the one side there and I can't get any X-DNA from my father's side. And my mother got it, she could have gotten it from either of her parents, but her father, my granddaddy Martin, he could not have gotten any X-DNA from his father because men cannot get X-DNA from their fathers. So I didn't certainly get any X-DNA from my great-grandfather Martin. And again, the purpose of these charts is to show you who you could have gotten X-DNA from. It is not telling you who you did get X-DNA from, because as I said, a woman might not give any X-DNA from one of her 2 parents when she gives X-DNA to her children. So the problem is genealogists. This is not even just a DNA problem. When we have a research question, a brick wall, a question that genealogy can help us with, first of all, we have to figure out what the question is. We can't start researching it until we exactly know what the question is. Same thing is true with DNA. But then for DNA, we need to know what the inheritance pattern is to figure out which DNA test should be taken. If I'm researching my Smiths, there's no point in me taking a mitochondrial test because the mitochondria that I have comes from my mother's side. It doesn't come from the Smiths. So that means a mitochondrial test would not be of any value. If on the other hand, I'm researching my mother's side, then taking a Y-DNA test would not be helpful for me. Now, the question then is who should take the test? So let's say, for example, that I am researching, if I'm taking Smiths, I'm going to take a Y-DNA test maybe to see if I can learn something about the Smiths. What if I'm researching the Martins, which is my mother's family? I can't take a Y-DNA test because I don't have the Martin Y-DNA. But guess what? I have male cousins on my mother's side who are Martins. That's their name. And those male cousins, they could take a Y-DNA test and they would help me in learning something about my Martin cousins and so forth. Now, it can be that you might have to take multiple tests, maybe a Y-DNA test and an autosomal test. Most times you're just going to do an autosomal. Autosomal tests tell you usually the most. So that's the most common test. It's the least expensive test too. And you might do several of them. You might take an autosomal test. You might get your brother or your sister to take an autosomal test. You might get have multiple test takers take autosomal tests. Your cousins. I know at least one DNA expert that suggests that if you really want to do this well, get all of your second cousins to take an autosomal test, because that way, as you match people, you can figure out which branch of the family they're matching on, because you know where your second cousins come from. And if they match you and they match your second cousin, you know they must be related on that side. So that can be very helpful. I want to say one other thing about autosomal testing before I leave it. Generally, when you take an autosomal test, you're going to have the oldest generation take it. Now, I am now in the oldest generation, but if my parents were still alive, I would have them do it. If my grandparents were still alive, I would have them do it, or my aunts and uncles, and so forth, because they have more of the DNA from the ancestors than I do, since 50% is essentially being lost every generation. But when you get other people to test, you need to be completely upfront with them. They need to understand what the ramifications are. We get very excited as genealogists when we can do DNA testing. We want everybody to test. We want all of our aunts, uncles, great aunts, great uncles, whatever, test. But if you go to Great Aunt Ethel, who's now in her 80s or 90s, and you say, Great Aunt Ethel, if you take an autosomal DNA test, this may help us break through a brick wall. Would you be willing? And she might go, well, yeah, if it can help. But Great Aunt Ethel might not realize that this could open up a family secret. Maybe when she was 16, she gave up a child for adoption and nobody in the family even knows. She might match that child or its children or grandchildren, and suddenly that secret is brought to light. And she may not understand that her taking a test could lead to that. So you really should never get any relative, any other person to test unless they understand all the possible ramifications. You don't want surprises here. Same thing, even if what happens when you test your brothers and sisters and some of them show that they have a different father than you do, or you have a different father than they do. You need to be prepared, and they need to be prepared before they take the test. And lastly, because I know we need time for Q&A here, I understand we're at that point, is just to say there are 5 major DNA testing companies. Ancestry and 23andMe are certainly the biggies. They've had the most people test. Family Tree DNA, I mentioned, is the ones that do Y-DNA and mitochondrial testing. The other companies don't. MyHeritage and Living DNA have gotten into the business. There is a difference in how they do the test. Ancestry and 23andMe do spitting into a tube. The others do a scraping cells from the inside of the cheek. Some elderly test takers sometimes have trouble with doing enough spit for the spit test, but guess what? Don't give up on using Ancestry DNA or 23andMe with your elderly test takers. There are even people who show YouTube videos on how to use artificial saliva mixed in with the scrapings to pass muster for an Ancestry DNA or 23andMe test. So that can be useful. And I know we have questions, so let's do the questions.
Thank you so much for that great presentation, Drew. Before we start the Q&A,
Oh yes,
I just want to let everyone know that our book shout out book, The Family Tree Guide to DNA Testing and Genetic Genealogy, which is a really great step-by-step guide to DNA testing, and will really help you guys build upon what Drew has started teaching us today. That is part of a book giveaway, and 5 attendees will win a free copy. If you're a winner, you will be contacted on your email. And also, I would like to point out that Drew made available handouts that you can download from the handout section. Let's see if anyone has any questions. We have our first question here about the intersex individuals. How does the different types of DNA affect them?
Right. So as I mentioned, I like to use this term typical. the typical woman has two X chromosomes, the typical man has an X and a Y, but we also know that there are individuals who have other combinations of X and Y. And they can do DNA testing. It is, anyone with a Y chromosome can do a Y DNA test, and anyone of any combination can do an autosomal test. So even individuals who are intersexed, who may have different combinations, that it should not affect that. I should have mentioned that when you take an autosomal test, they also look at your xDNA. So that's added automatically. There is no separate xDNA test. You just do an autosomal test and you get autosomal and xDNA. They're all tested there. But yeah, I've not heard of anyone with problems doing these tests. Just be aware that, yeah, when I was using the terminology, I was referring to typical individuals, but we know that human beings have a lot of diversity, and so, yeah, there could be others.
All right. What if there is a conflict between the DNA results versus the genealogical records I find in databases or vital statistics?
Yeah, I mean, we again talk about, we have a genealogical family tree, we have a genetic family tree. They aren't necessarily the same, because the genetic tree is going to deal exclusively with, biological parents, and we know that in with our ancestors that sometimes people were adopted without any formal adoption documentation. We know that, again, the father may have been someone else, but the child was raised as the child of the mother's husband. So DNA can help with that. It means you may have to go to the matches to maybe try to figure out who the actual biological parent or parents were, by maybe looking to see who was living in the same places at the same time. So in some cases, you're going to actually have to work on a whole nother family tree once you've discovered that you're matching people that you were not expecting to match. And of course, it can be on the other side too. That person may be matching because their biological ancestor is really one of yours who fathered a child, with someone else. I've Everybody discovers this. I think I matched. I thought I knew all my second cousins. I ended up matching someone who I did not know who they were. And the person, as I communicate with them, or their daughter who was managing their test, she said, well, her mother, her grandmother was the offspring of an unmarried couple. And she actually knew the name of the unmarried couple. And as soon as she gave the name, I'm like, that's my grandfather's brother. And I didn't know he fathered a child outside of his marriage, and yet there they were. And I don't know if his wife knew. I don't know if his children knew. They've all passed many years ago, and I'm not contacting my second cousins to let them know. It's not my place to do that. But yeah, we do come across this, and it just means you may have to do some additional research, traditional research too.
Are there any legal risks to taking a DNA test?
So one of the things, that's a great question. Are there legal risks? In the United States, there is a law, a Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, GINA. I think it's Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, that if you take a test, well, you cannot be denied life insurance. I'm sorry, health insurance based on your DNA, health insurance. So health insurers cannot discriminate on the basis of DNA. Major employers of a certain size, number of employees, cannot discriminate on the basis of DNA. So even if somehow someone got a hold of your results and learned something from them, those companies, those organizations couldn't use it. Now, I mean, legally. Life insurers can. Very small companies that aren't at that threshold of however many employees could, because, so, and the act itself, we know that acts can be repealed too. So we can't promise that your information will always be legally protected. The companies themselves, they'll go to great lengths to keep your information private. You are given some options to share. You are given options to participate in law enforcement activities or not, not on Ancestry, specifically on other companies. Family Tree DNA or GEDmatch is another company that does some of this stuff. You can decide to have your DNA be part of research studies or not. That's your choice. And those are personal decisions you have to make. I know sometimes when you try to get a cousin to test, they are nervous about this. They're worried about it. But yeah, I mean, the companies do take great care to keep everything private.
One last question, and then we'll have to go. Are there any resources that you recommend to help sort through different DNA results?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, the books, of course, can be helpful for more reading, and I think I have both Blaine's book that and Diane Souther just came out with a new book this year, which kind of gives you through the steps of how to solve genealogy problems with DNA testing. Those are great resources. There are websites that have a lot of information. ISOG, the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, ISOGG. You go to their website, they have a wiki, which articles explaining a lot of DNA things. You may want to go to the isog.org website. And there are many Facebook groups. Blaine Bettinger started one several years ago that now has something like 60,000 people in it. And people can post their DNA questions there. So, and there are actually multiple DNA groups out there. There's tons of them. There's one I've been involved with for years called DNA Newbie. So we do really basic questions, and that's, so yeah, you can look on Facebook. There are even Facebook groups for particular places like counties in Ireland and DNA for that and so forth. So lots of good resources on Facebook.
Thank you so much, Drew. And that was a great presentation. I'll turn it over to Chris now.
Thanks, Carmen.
Thank you. Yeah, that was fantastic, Drew. We really appreciate both workshops that you led during the Heritage Festival.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Now, if you'd like to contact the library, you can call the number here on your screen, or you can go online at hcplc.org/contact. And also, Heritage Festival is not over. We have one more event coming up at 2 p.m. It's called Putting DNA to Work. Denise Manning will be back leading that session. And to learn more and to register, you can go to hcplc.org/familyhistory. And of course, you can learn about our genealogy resources at hcplc.org/research/genealogy. And with that, I'm going to say thank you to everyone here. Thank you for attending, and we will see you soon. Bye, everybody.